The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the emergency room at Memorial General Hospital, casting their harsh white glow over sterile floors that had seen too much pain, too much fear, too much of life's darkest moments. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, the kind of hour when the world feels forgotten and hope seems as distant as dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In bed 7 lay a man who looked like trouble to anyone who didn't know better. Jake Roadblock. Morrison stretched 6 feet 4 inches down the narrow hospital gurney, his massive frame making the standard-issue bed look like it belonged in a dollhouse. Tattoos covered every visible inch of his arms and neck, telling stories in ink that most people would rather not read. His leather vest hung on the chair beside him, patches sewn with military precision, declaring his allegiance to the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. But it wasn't his appearance that had caught the attention of Sarah Chan, the night shift nurse who'd been working emergency medicine for 8 years. It was the way he held himself, the careful stillness of someone trying not to show how much everything hurt. The motorcycle accident that brought him in had left him with 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and road rash that looked like someone had dragged him across 50 yards of asphalt. What the accident report didn't mention, what the police officer who'd filled out the paperwork hadn't bothered to investigate, was why Jake had been riding his Harley at nearly midnight on a rain-slicked highway with no destination in mind. Why he'd been pushing his bike harder and faster until the laws of physics finally intervened, sending him sliding across the wet pavement in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. If you believe that sometimes the worst nights lead to the most unexpected miracles, that heroes come in forms we don't expect, and that family isn't always about blood, then pause right here. Like this video, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because what happened next would restore anyone's faith in the power of human connection. Sarah had been a nurse long enough to recognize the signs. The way Jake flinched when anyone approached too quickly. The way his eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way he'd refused pain medication stronger than ibuprofen, insisting he needed to stay alert. She'd seen it before in domestic violence victims, in abuse survivors, in people who'd learned the hard way that safety was an illusion and vigilance was survival. But this was different. Jake Morrison wasn't someone you'd typically think of as a victim. At 34, he stood like a mountain and looked like he could handle any trouble that came his way. The patches on his vest told stories of military service, of brotherhood forged in places where weakness meant death. The scars on his knuckles suggested he'd never backed down from a fight in his life. Yet here he was, checking his phone every 30 seconds, his jaw clenched with tension that had nothing to do with his injuries. Every time the automatic doors to the emergency room opened, his entire body went rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the leather vest that held more significance than most people could understand. Sarah had learned to read people quickly in this job. 8 years of emergency medicine had taught her to see past the surface, to recognize when someone was running from something more dangerous than physical pain. She'd treated gang members who were gentler than some college professors, and she'd seen supposedly upstanding citizens who made her skin crawl. Appearances, she'd learned, were almost always deceiving. As she checked Jake's vitals for the 3rd time that hour, adjusting his IV and noting his blood pressure on the chart, she caught him staring at the window that faced the parking lot. His eyes weren't focused on anything specific, but the set of his shoulders told her everything she needed to know. He was waiting for something, someone, and whatever it was, it terrified him more than the motorcycle accident that could have killed him. "Everything looks good," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the kind of professional calm that she'd perfected over years of delivering news, both good and devastating. "Dr. Williams wants to keep you for observation until morning. Make sure there's no internal bleeding we missed. You should be able to go home tomorrow afternoon." Jake nodded, but she could see he wasn't really listening. His attention was divided between his phone and the parking lot, and the tension radiating from him was palpable. Sarah had seen this before, This particular kind of fear that had nothing to do with medical procedures or hospital bills. "Is there someone I should call?" she asked gently, pulling up the visitor's chair beside his bed. It was a small gesture, but one that transformed her from just another hospital employee into someone who cared enough to sit down, to make time for conversation instead of rushing to the next patient. Jake's laugh was bitter, completely devoid of humor. "Yeah, there's someone you should call. The question is whether I want you to." He ran his good hand through hair that was still matted with blood from the accident, leaving dark streaks on his fingers. "My ex-wife has been persistent lately. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The word persistent hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah had heard that particular euphemism before, usually from patients who were trying to minimize something that was actually much worse than they wanted to admit. She waited, giving him space to continue if he wanted to, knowing from experience that sometimes people needed to tell their story at their own pace. "Rebecca and I divorced 2 years ago," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or at least, I thought we did. She's been having trouble accepting that it's over." He held up his phone, showing Sarah a screen full of missed calls and text messages. The timestamp on the most recent message was less than 5 minutes ago. Sarah didn't need to read the messages to understand. The number of calls told the story clearly enough. 47 missed calls since midnight. This wasn't someone trying to reach an ex-husband about shared custody or forgotten belongings. This was harassment, stalking, the kind of obsessive behavior that escalated from annoying to dangerous with terrifying speed. "She was at my apartment building when I left tonight," Jake said, his voice dropping even lower. "Standing in the parking lot, just watching. That's why I took the bike out. I needed to get away, to think, to figure out what to do. I've tried everything legal, restraining orders, police reports, changing my locks, even moving to a different apartment across town. Nothing stops her." As if summoned by his words, Jake's phone began buzzing again. Rebecca's name flashed across the screen, accompanied by a photo that had probably been taken during happier times. A blonde woman with bright blue eyes and a smile that looked innocent enough, the kind of person you'd never suspect of being capable of the behavior Jake was describing. Jake let the call go to voicemail, but his hand was shaking now. Sarah noticed the tremor and understood it had nothing to do with his injuries. This was the shake of someone who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point, someone who'd exhausted every normal option for dealing with an impossible situation. "The thing is," Jake said, "I'm not supposed to be afraid of anyone. You know what I mean? I'm 6'4", I've got military training. I've been in more fights than I can count. I should be able to handle one 5'2" woman who weighs maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. But she's relentless. And smart. Too smart." Sarah understood the shame in his voice. Society had very specific ideas about who could be a victim and who couldn't. A man like Jake Morrison, with his size and his scars and his motorcycle club patches, wasn't supposed to need protection from anyone, especially not from an ex-wife who looked like she belonged in a college sorority rather than a criminal lineup. But Sarah had seen enough in her years as a nurse to know that abuse didn't follow society's convenient stereotypes. She'd treated male victims before. Men who were ashamed to admit they needed help, who felt emasculated by their inability to stop someone smaller and weaker from systematically destroying their lives. "She knows where I work, where I live, where I shop, where I get my bike serviced," Jake continued. "She's made friends with my neighbors, told them we're getting back together, that I'm just going through a rough patch. Half of them think I'm the problem, that I'm being cruel to this sweet woman who just wants to work things out." The phone buzzed again. Another call from Rebecca. Jake's jaw clenched as he declined it, but Sarah could see the toll this was taking on him. The exhaustion went deeper than his physical injuries. This was the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting a war nobody else could see, someone who'd been gaslit so thoroughly that he was starting to question his own reality. "She's been calling my work, telling my boss that I'm having a mental breakdown, that I need help. She's contacted my parole officer." Jake stopped, realizing what he'd revealed. Yeah, I did time. 5 years for aggravated assault. Guy was beating his girlfriend in a parking lot, and I intervened. Maybe I went too far, but I'd do it again. Some things are more important than staying out of trouble. Sarah nodded, understanding now why Jake was so reluctant to involve the police. A man with a criminal record complaining about harassment from his ex-wife wasn't likely to get much sympathy from law enforcement, especially when the woman in question looked like Rebecca probably did in her driver's license photo. She knows exactly how to work the system, Jake said. 1. She's got no criminal record, a college degree, a job as a social worker. On paper, she's the perfect victim, and I'm the dangerous ex-husband with anger management issues. Every time I try to get help, she turns it around, makes it look like I'm the one who won't leave her alone. The phone buzzed a third time. This time, instead of declining the call, Jake answered it, putting it on speaker so Sarah could hear. He didn't say hello, just held the phone and waited. "Jake, baby, I know you're there." Rebecca's voice was sweet, almost sing-song, but there was something underneath it that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I saw the ambulance, honey. I've been waiting here at the hospital for hours, but they won't let me see you. I told them I'm your wife, but these awful people won't listen to me." Jake's face had gone pale. "How did you know I was here?" "Oh, sweetheart, you know I worry about you when you take that dangerous motorcycle out in the rain. I was just making sure you got home safely when I saw the accident. I followed the ambulance because I love you and I was scared." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Rebecca hadn't just stumbled across the accident scene. She'd been following Jake, stalking him through the night, watching him closely enough to witness his crash and track him to the hospital. The casual way she admitted it, as if following someone through a storm was perfectly normal behavior, revealed a level of obsession that was genuinely frightening. "Rebecca, we're divorced. You can't keep doing this." "Oh, honey, that silly piece of paper doesn't mean anything. You know we belong together. You're just confused right now because of all the stress you've been under. Once you get better, once you remember how good we were together, you'll come home where you belong." Jake hung up the phone, his hands shaking more violently now. Sarah could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the emergency room. The conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had taken a visible toll on him. "She's been saying things like that for 2 years, Jake said quietly. "In her mind, we're still married. The divorce never happened. I'm just going through a phase, having some kind of breakdown that she needs to help me through. She's rewritten our entire history to fit her version of reality." Sarah glanced toward the window that faced the parking lot. If Rebecca was out there somewhere, waiting, watching, then Jake's fear was completely justified. This wasn't just harassment. This was stalking by someone who had completely detached from reality. Someone who was convinced that her delusions were more real than legal documents and restraining orders. "She's gotten into my apartment twice," Jake continued. "Changed things around, left little gifts, cooked dinner, and left it in my refrigerator with notes about how she's taking care of me. The police said there was no evidence of forced entry, so they couldn't do anything. She probably still has a key from when we were married." The phone buzzed with a text message. Jake hesitated, then showed it to Sarah. The message was a photo of the hospital parking lot, taken from inside a car. The timestamp showed it had been sent 30 seconds ago. "Waiting for you, baby. Take all the time you need to get better. I'll be right here, always. Your loving wife." Sarah's blood ran cold. Rebecca wasn't just at the hospital. She was in the parking lot right now, close enough to photograph the building, close enough to see anyone who came or went. Jake would have to walk through that parking lot to get to his motorcycle, assuming it was even still drivable after the accident. "Jake," Sarah said carefully, "has she ever been violent? Ever threatened to hurt you or herself?" Jake's laugh was hollow. "She's too smart for direct threats. But she's escalating. Started showing up at my job site, talking to my coworkers, trying to convince them that I need help. She's contacted my probation officer 6 times in the last month, always with some new concern about my mental state or my anger issues." He paused, staring at the ceiling tiles, as if they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Last week, She left a bottle of my favorite whiskey in my apartment with a note about how she knows I've been drinking too much since our separation. Thing is, I've been sober for 3 years. Haven't touched alcohol since I got out of prison, but she's building a narrative, creating evidence that I'm unstable, unreliable, dangerous. Sarah understood now why Jake was so afraid. Rebecca wasn't just stalking him. She was systematically destroying his credibility, his reputation, his support system. She was isolating him by making everyone around him doubt his version of events, question his stability, wonder if maybe he really was the problem. "I can't call my club brothers," Jake said. "If a bunch of bikers show up here, if there's any kind of confrontation, I'm the one who goes back to prison." She knows that. She's counting on it. The Iron Wolves. Sarah had heard of them, had treated a few of their members over the years. Contrary to what most people assumed, they weren't criminals or outlaws. They were mostly veterans, working-class men who'd found brotherhood and purpose in their shared love of motorcycles and their commitment to looking out for each other. But Sarah also understood Jake's dilemma. Any involvement from his motorcycle club would be seen as intimidation, as a group of dangerous men ganging up on one defenseless woman. The optics would be terrible, the legal consequences potentially devastating for Jake. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah said. "Some way to get you home safely." Jake's phone buzzed again. Another text from Rebecca. "The doctor says you might need surgery on your shoulder. I've already talked to them about being your emergency contact since your poor parents are so far away. Don't worry, baby. I'll take care of everything. I'll take you home and nurse you back to health, just like a real wife should." Jake stared at the message, his face cycling through emotions too complex for Sarah to read. Fear, anger, exhaustion, and something that looked almost like despair. "She's never going to stop," he said quietly. "I could move to another state, change my name, start over completely, and she'd find me. She's made me her entire life's purpose." Sarah made a decision that went against hospital protocol, against her professional training, against every rule in the employee handbook. But sometimes rules weren't enough. Sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks that couldn't be justified on paper. "Jake," she said, leaning closer so she could speak without being overheard by the other staff. "I need to tell you something. My brother Danny is in a motorcycle club. Not your club, but they all know each other, They have connections." Jake's eyes sharpened, focusing on her with new interest. "Danny's club, they've helped people before. People in situations like yours. Not vigilante stuff," she added quickly, seeing the concern on his face. "Legal stuff. Protection, escorts, witnesses, things like that. People who know how to handle situations where the regular system isn't working." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found her brother's number. "If I called Danny, explained the situation, would you be willing to let them help? Not to confront Rebecca, not to do anything that would get you in trouble. Just to make sure you get home safely. Maybe help you figure out some options you haven't thought of?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Sarah could see him calculating risks, considering consequences, trying to decide whether accepting help was worth the potential complications. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, I think I need to try something different. What I've been doing isn't working." Sarah dialed her brother's number. It was after 4 a.m., but Danny Chin was a night owl who rarely went to bed before dawn. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "Sarah, everything okay? You never called during your shift unless." "Danny, I need a favor. A big one. There's a guy here, Iron Wolves member, and he's got a stalking problem that's gotten out of hand. His ex-wife is in the parking lot right now, and he's afraid to leave the hospital." She explained the situation quickly, giving Danny the relevant details while Jake listened. When she finished, there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Iron Wolves, huh? Jake Morrison? Roadblock?" Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You know me?" "Know of you," Danny's voice came through the speaker. "Word gets around. You're the guy who did time for stopping that piece of shit from beating his girlfriend in the Walmart parking lot." A lot of people respect what you did, even if the law didn't see it that way. Jake looked genuinely surprised. He'd spent 2 years feeling like he was fighting this battle alone, convinced that his criminal record made him unworthy of help or sympathy. Hearing that other people knew his story, understood why he'd made the choices he'd made, seemed to lift some invisible weight from his shoulders. "Let me make some calls," Danny continued. "I'll reach out to your club president, get some people together. This isn't just about helping you, man. This kind of thing, when someone uses the system against people, it affects all of us. We can't let that slide." After Danny hung up, Sarah sat with Jake in comfortable silence. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and the hospital settled into the quiet rhythm of the pre-dawn hours. Jake's phone had stopped buzzing, which somehow made Sarah more nervous rather than less. Rebecca's silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked suddenly. "You don't know me. You could get in trouble for getting involved." Sarah considered the question, thinking about her brother Danny and the stories he'd told her about his motorcycle club brothers. Stories about men who'd served their country, who'd been let down by the system, who'd found family and purpose in the most unexpected places. "Because you remind me of my brother," she said finally. "Not physically, but." Danny came back from Afghanistan. Pretty messed up, PTSD, nightmares, the whole thing. The VA didn't help much, and he was headed down a really dark path. Then he found his club, found people who understood what he'd been through, who didn't judge him for the things he had to do to survive. She paused, remembering those difficult years when she wasn't sure her brother would make it. Danny's been clean for 4 years now. Has a job, an apartment, people who care about him. But it took other people believing in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Sometimes that's all any of us need. Someone who sees past the surface, who recognizes that we're more than our worst moments. Jake's phone rang. Not Rebecca this time, but a number he recognized. Tank Rodriguez, president of the Iron Wolves, and one of the few people Jake trusted completely. "Roadblock, you okay?" Danny Chin called. "Told me what's been going on. Why didn't you come to us sooner?" Jake's voice cracked slightly when he answered. "Didn't want to bring the club into my personal mess. Figured I could handle it myself." "Brother, your mess is our mess. That's what the patch means. We're on our way." Within an hour, the hospital parking lot began to fill with motorcycles. They arrived in groups of 3 and 4, their engines rumbling like distant thunder, chrome gleaming under the security lights. Sarah watched from Jake's window as leather-clad figures dismounted their bikes and organized themselves with military precision. But these weren't just Iron Wolves members. Word had spread through the motorcycle community faster than Sarah would have thought possible. She counted patches from at least 6 different clubs: Desert Riders, Road Warriors, Freedom Brotherhood, Steel Horses, Thunder Valley MC, and others she didn't recognize. Danny Chen appeared in the emergency room 20 minutes later, still wearing his Road Warriors vest over a hospital scrubs top. He'd come straight from his job as a trauma technician at City General, calling in favors to get someone to cover the rest of his shift. "Roadblock, I'm Danny," he said, extending his hand to Jake. "Sarah's told me a lot about your situation. We've got about 40 riders out there right now, with more on the way. But before we do anything, we need to talk strategy." Tank Rodriguez arrived shortly after, a man whose presence immediately commanded respect. At 55, he was old enough to be taken seriously by police and young enough to still be formidable in a confrontation. His Iron Wolves patch identified him as president, but it was his bearing that marked him as a natural leader. "First things first," Tank said, pulling up a chair beside Jake's bed. "We're not here to confront your ex-wife directly. That would only make things worse for you legally. We're here to escort you home safely and help you explore some options you might not have considered." He opened a folder he'd brought with him, revealing documents that Sarah didn't expect to see in a hospital room. "One of our members, Preacher Williams, used to be a family court judge before he retired. Another one, Counselor Martinez, is a social worker who specializes in domestic violence cases. We've got people who understand the system, who know how to work within it to get results." Jake stared at the documents, seeming overwhelmed by the level of organization and preparation these men had brought to his problem. The thing about stalking cases, Tank continued, is that they require documentation, patterns of behavior that can be proven in court. Your ex-wife thinks she's been clever, but she's actually been creating evidence against herself. All those phone calls, text messages, photos she's been sending, that's admissible in court. Danny pulled out his own phone, showing Jake an app he downloaded. This records all your phone calls automatically, logs every text message, tracks when and where photos were taken. From now on, every contact she makes with you gets documented with timestamps and locations. After a few weeks, you'll have enough evidence to get a restraining order that actually means something. Sarah watched Jake's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. For 2 years, he'd been fighting this battle alone, convinced that his criminal record and his intimidating appearance made him unworthy of help. Now, he was surrounded by people who not only believed his story, but had actual experience helping people in similar situations. "But what about tonight?" Jake asked. "She's still out there in the parking lot." Tank smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had met him, Jake looked genuinely hopeful. "Tonight, we give her a demonstration of what community looks like. Nothing threatening, nothing that could be construed as intimidation. Just a group of concerned citizens making sure a friend gets home safely." Danny explained the plan. The motorcycles would form an escort convoy, completely legal and carefully choreographed to avoid any appearance of aggression. Jake would ride in the middle of the formation, protected by riders who knew how to handle themselves in difficult situations. But more importantly, Tank added, "We're going to make sure Rebecca understands that you're not alone anymore. That if anything happens to you, there are people who will notice, people who will ask questions, people who will make sure the truth comes out." Sarah realized what they were doing. It wasn't intimidation in the traditional sense. It was demonstration of community, a show of support that would make it clear to Rebecca that Jake wasn't an isolated target anymore. She'd have to think twice about escalating her behavior when she knew that 40 witnesses were paying attention. At 6 a.m., just as the morning shift was arriving and the emergency room was beginning to buzz with new activity, Dr. Williams signed Jake's discharge papers. His injuries were painful but not serious, and the X-rays had ruled out any internal damage that would require surgery. Jake changed back into his riding clothes, wincing as he pulled on his leather vest. The iron wool's patch looked different to Sarah now. What she'd initially seen as a symbol of potential trouble, she now understood as a badge of brotherhood, a declaration of loyalty that meant Jake would never have to face his problems alone again. The convoy formation was impressive in its precision. 43 motorcycles arranged in a diamond pattern with Jake's rebuilt Harley at the center. Each rider had been briefed on traffic laws, hand signals, and emergency procedures. This wasn't a show of force. It was a masterclass in organization and mutual protection. Rebecca's car was still in the parking lot when they emerged from the hospital. A silver Honda Civic parked under a light pole where she could watch the emergency room entrance. Sarah could see her silhouette in the driver's seat, probably wondering why so many motorcycles had gathered overnight. The convoy fired up, their engines simultaneously, a rumble that echoed off the hospital walls like controlled thunder. Jake took his position in the center of the formation, and slowly, carefully, the entire group began to move. Sarah watched from the emergency room window as 43 motorcycles rolled past Rebecca's Honda in perfect formation. The woman's head was turned, following the procession with what Sarah imagined was complete bewilderment. This wasn't what she'd expected when she'd followed Jake to the hospital. Danny stayed behind to talk with Sarah, waiting until the convoy disappeared into the pre-dawn traffic before he spoke. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Jake's going to need ongoing support, people checking on him, witnesses to document Rebecca's behavior. But he's got that now. Word's already gone out to every club in the tri-state area. If Rebecca escalates, if she tries anything more serious, there will be people watching." 3 weeks later, Sarah received a text message from Jake with a photo attached. It showed a court document, a permanent restraining order with Rebecca's signature acknowledging its terms. The constant documentation had worked, faced with irrefutable evidence of her stalking behavior and the knowledge that Jake was no longer isolated and vulnerable. Rebecca had finally accepted that the divorce was real. But the story didn't end with legal documents. Over the following months, Sarah learned that Jake had become something of an advocate within the motorcycle community for male victims of domestic violence and stalking. His experience and the network of support that had formed around him became a model for helping other men who found themselves in similar situations. The Iron Wolves started a program called Road Home, providing support, documentation assistance, and protective escorts for abuse victims regardless of their connection to motorcycle clubs. Tank Rodriguez partnered with legitimate domestic violence organizations, bringing resources and expertise that had been missing from traditional support networks. Jake himself began speaking at meetings, sharing his story with other men who felt too ashamed or too proud to ask for help. His message was simple. Accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Sarah kept the card Danny had given her that night, a simple piece of paper with a phone number and the words, "Road Home, no one rides alone." She'd referred 3 other patients to the program over the following year, all of them men who'd been failed by traditional support systems. All of them convinced they had to face their problems alone. The last time Sarah saw Jake, he was visiting the emergency room to drop off informational cards for the Road Home program. He looked different, lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. His smile was genuine, his laugh easy, his eyes clear of the fear that had defined him during those dark months with Rebecca. You know what the difference was? He asked Sarah as they talked in the break room. It wasn't the motorcycles or the tough guys or any of that. It was finding out I wasn't alone, that there were people who believed me, who understood what I was going through, who were willing to help without judging me for needing help. He paused, looking out the window at the parking lot where his story had reached its turning point. For 2 years, I thought I was weak because I couldn't handle one small woman. Turns out, I wasn't weak. I was just fighting the wrong battle. You can't beat a system by yourself. But when you've got community, when you've got people who understand what you're going through, suddenly the impossible becomes possible. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes come in unexpected forms and that community can triumph over isolation, then please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Help us spread the word that no one has to face their battles alone, that support comes from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the people society fears most are the ones most willing to protect those who need protection. Comment below with "No one rides alone" if you believe in the power of community to overcome injustice. And before this story ends, remember that Jake's story is playing out right now in communities across the country. Men and women who feel trapped, isolated, convinced they have to solve impossible problems by themselves. They need to know that help exists, that there are people who understand, that accepting support isn't weakness but wisdom. Share this story. Be the voice that reminds someone they're not alone. Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to make a phone call, one nurse willing to bend the rules, one brother willing to wake up his friends in the middle of the night. Sometimes all it takes is community choosing to act like community. And that choice, that decision to stand together instead of standing apart, that's how real change happens. One story at a time. One person at a time. One act of courage at a time. The road home isn't always easy, but no one has to ride it alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.